بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. Today's topic is on Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is what Spain, essentially not all of Spain, but a large portion of Spain, was called from a period of time that it was ruled by predominantly Muslims. That period of time is from 711 AD up until essentially 1492, when Isabella and Ferdinand conquered the last stronghold of Islamic Spain in Granada. The reason that we're having this topic is because Al-Andalus represents a civilization that is a marked indicator of the fact that what, for example, is promoted by right-wing extremists today as Western civilization, and the notion that the West comes from some sort of society based upon a particular race, this being white race, and from a uniqueness with regard to the rationality of white peoples, is essentially the dawn and the beginning of civilization. We'll find out today that nothing could be further from the truth. That a large portion of the formulation of what we call Western civilization is a result of the period of time when the Muslims controlled Spain. However, it is also very important to recognize that the narrative that surrounds Al-Andalus is also commonly mistaken. That inside of this narrative comes the principles upon which we could have a paradigm shift in human consciousness where we to return to them and develop them and advance them. But at the same time, in the minds of many Muslims, for example, Al-Andalus represents something to aspire or return to. When there were attacks in Madrid, Barcelona in 2017, where ISIS supporters had been plotting a bombing attack, and after the bomb that they were making went off and malfunctioned, they proceeded to drive their cars down the street and mow people down. A lot of the propaganda that surfaced thereafter was that this was an attack carried out by ISIS, and then they referenced the fact that Al-Andalus and Spain was formerly part of an Islamic system, and that they were carrying out the attacks in part due to their quest in the future to reestablish control. Now, what we'll learn today is that even if ISIS ever did establish control of Al-Andalus, and if they were able to reflect upon the history, the very same Muslims that they kill today for not agreeing with their creed, they would hold the Al-Andalusian Muslims and their tolerance in particular for other religions and other peoples, poetry and music and the like, as cause for their making takfir on them, meaning their excommunication from the fold of Islam, the consideration that they were in fact not Muslims at all, and that they could conquer, and that they could fight. Now, the other issue that needs to be brought up is that there is a nostalgia that revolves around the Andalus, held by Muslims as if it is representative of something also to aspire to. And these could be traditional Muslims who simply continue to interpret the texts as if they cannot be reinterpreted through a lens that is of the modern era and of modern principles. Tolerance and compassion and consciousness that we're going to discuss today must be understood in its historical context. It was not a utopia. It was not representative of the kind of equal rights and liberties that we value and cherish as part of the liberal order we live in today. But, relatively speaking, it was a culture of tolerance. Today, oftentimes, when even moderate preachers preach about Al-Andalus and the great history of Islamic Spain, a lot of it is warranted. But the idea that we should aspire to return to an era where Jews and Christians lived under jizya and having to pay a tax, or where, as time progressed, we saw in Islamic Spain an oppression against minority populations, meaning Christians and Jews could only do particular jobs that were not related to governmental positions, meaning that they were confined, that Muslims were not allowed to clean bathrooms, for example, and that they were. This is not a return to a utopia that we're discussing. What this is our today's discussion is representation of what Thomas Kuhn, a person who studied raw natural sciences, called a paradigm shift. Now, a lot of times people will apply this concept of a paradigm shift to the social sciences, and it's not what Kuhn meant. So when we talk of a Kuhnian paradigm shift, what we mean is where we live in a period of time where the old ways of studying and analyzing something no longer work, where the paradigm and the methodology through which we view the world is altering due to advancements in science and alternative thinking outside of the box, an alternative perspective, an alternative worldview, and an alternative system begin to influence and become apparent that the old way of thinking no longer works. We're on the threshold of a sort of a crossway into the future of our history. We are now living in an age of intersecting and mutually reinforcing extremisms, all of which are pushing radicalization to higher levels. And if we live in a world where radicalization is increasing on both sides as a consequence of polarization and warring internal, and that by its very nature, if there's an increased pool of radicals, there will be an increased number and proportion of those that are susceptible to the adoption of violent extremist ideologies, and that the low base rate of people that go on from adhering to radical ideologies and committing violence will quite naturally increase as a result of the increasing pool of radicalization, then we can understand that we are facing an era where the decisions that we make will determine the world that we live in tomorrow. That being the case, one could envision an outline for the future where the creeping authoritarianism that we see both domestic to Western societies and propagated by countries like Iran, Russia, China, and others begins to gain influence to the degree where it threatens the international liberal order that we live in. And I think the principles of the liberal order that we live in are well worth, quote unquote, fighting for. But if we're going to address the problems that we face today, we have to take into consideration something akin to what Albert Einstein once said, that you cannot address a problem with the same level of consciousness that created it. And so this talk is called A Dialogue of Civilization, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Spain, and a New Andalusian Enlightenment. So what the New Andalusian Enlightenment represents is a model that we call a dialogue of civilization in the singular, and we will find out why. However, first, before we take that journey into our conclusion and what we can learn from what happened in Andalus for the first couple hundred years of Islamic rule there particularly, we will cover the historical progression. We will cover the fall of Al-Andalus. And we will cover how, in the course of what started as a tolerant society and a paradigm shift in human organization, social arrangements, and consciousness and the role of intellectualism and the arts turned into something that went internally malfunction. That exclusivity and the war that ensued between Muslims and Christians, a war that is replicated in many ways today in the paradigm that we live in under the global war on terror, is something that can only be combated if we heighten and expand the principles that we'll espouse in this lecture on Islamic Spain. What this intends to do is to shatter the view that Western civilization is something unique and special in and of itself, and to promote the view the only way to resolve today's issues is to engage in a dialogue of civilization in the singular as opposed to a clash of civilizations in the plural. Civilization is rather a byproduct of all of humankind. It is not relegated to one particular culture or ethnicity or race. It is largely a consequence of us all from the time that we spread from Africa and proceeded to populate the world to the time now where we live in a world blanketed by nation states and embroiled in largely everyone is affected by the global war on terror and the clash of civilizations paradigm. 18 years in, I think it's time to think about things differently. So we begin the story with an anecdotal. We don't begin Islamic Spain by talking about its great advancements in science and agriculture and philosophy and logic and intellectualism and religion and tolerance. We begin the story of Islamic Spain with a single person, an incredibly influential person that would go on to change history and serves as an example for humanity far into the future, quite frankly. In 750 AD, the very first remnants of the first caliphate of the Prophet Muhammad were falling. The Umayyad Caliphate, which was a result of about 100 years of rule after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So after the Prophet Muhammad died, we had the reign of the Khalifa Abu Bakr, his best friend. Abu Bakr ruled for 2 years, and he ruled the Muslims in a time where there was civil strife and conflict, and there was no opportunity for expansion or cohesive formulation. And Umar bin al-Khattab, who Abu Bakr passed the mantle to become the leader of the Muslims 2 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, ruled for over a decade and witnessed the expansion of Islam to the point where it literally conquered 2 former empires within a period of Umar bin al-Khattab's reign. These 2 empires were the Persians and they were the Romans. And so in a very short period of time, within 100 years after what would happen. So Umar bin al-Khattab was, of course, followed by Uthman bin Affan. And Uthman was murdered at the hands of some very serious, violent jihadi extremists, what we would call them today. The Prophet predicted that there would arise a group from amongst his followers that would interpret the Quran very literally, but that the meaning of it would not go past their throats. That they would speak very good words, meaning they would quote the religious tenets and the principles, and they would sound wonderful to their adherents, but they were the evilest creatures on the earth. And this caused internal conflict that was only determined in the 4th Khalifa's reign, who was Ali, the nephew of the Prophet Muhammad. And Ali reigned during a period when the discord that was promoted by Uthman's death at the hands of the extremists had continued to fragment Islamic society. And because he did not rescue Uthman's family from the turmoil that was caused by these extremists, and because he did not aggressively pursue and arrest or kill these extremists, people that were in Mecca and Medina, people that were affiliated with Uthman, from the family of Uthman, rebelled. And those 2 people were very significant people. They were the second wife of the Prophet Muhammad, Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, who was a woman who spent so much time with the Prophet Muhammad that the majority of how we treat our lives as Muslims is based upon her narrations of what the Prophet did in his house, how tolerant and kind he was to his wives. The way that we treat our wives as Muslims comes predominantly from these narrations. She was considered the mother of the believers. And her associate, Muawiyah, was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad from a clan, the Umayyad clan, which was a faction of the Quraysh, the tribe that the Prophet came to. Muawiyah went on to fight against Ali. And he went on to claim control of the caliphate after the death of Ali, who was assassinated by one of these extremists. And so Muawiyah started the Umayyad Caliphate that went and established its basis from Medina in Saudi Arabia today to Damascus. And when the Umayyad Caliphate spread to Damascus, it was immediately brought into contact with the cultures and the influences of those 2 empires that Uthman, or that Umar bin al-Khattab during his reign, had watched the expansion of Islam into. And under Muawiyah and the Umayyad reign, Islam spread all the way into China and as far as Spain in the West. Now, the Umayyads were very different because when they expanded, they came into contact with these cultures that were foreign to Islam, cultures that had not, like the Arab culture, been unrefined by the deserts. And instead, they came into contact with a more developed and advanced civilization. And they absorbed that civilization. They absorbed those principles of that civilization, and they lived with tolerance for the other. At the same time, the Umayyads made a mistake because the people that they ruled over, they charged a tax called the jizya, which is a tax that Christians and Jews and people that are considered worthy of living under Islamic rule pay in order that they don't have to serve in the military and in order that the Muslim state can benefit from their rule. Now, the intention of this principle in the Sharia is that non-Muslims will be encouraged to convert to Islam in order to evade the tax. And when the Umayyads were faced with this possibility that people would convert and tax revenue would decrease, they did not accept their conversions. And so people that had converted but were forced to continue to pay the jizya were galvanized by who were known as the Abbasids. The Abbasids were direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad through his nephew Ibn Abbas, who was one of his primary students. And so the Abbasids rebelled against the Umayyad Caliphate, and they fought a long period of wars that ultimately culminated in 750 of the overthrow of the Umayyad Caliphate and the replacement of it with the Abbasids. And the place that the last stronghold of the Umayyad Caliphate existed was Damascus. And our protagonist that begins the conquest and the story of Spain that we're about to divulge in is a prince of the Umayyad Caliphate. So the Abbasids, they conquered Damascus, and they were on their way to conquering. And in order to make sure that in the future they didn't have to face any retaliation or return of the Umayyads, they called all of the royal family, all of the Umayyad princes and the Khalifa, and all of the heirs that could possibly be considered future promoters of a return to the Umayyad system to a banquet. They called them to a banquet on the guise that there would be a truce signed. And instead, they fed them, they fattened them up, and then they massacred every single one of them. So the entire Umayyad royal hair, if you will, monarchy, is actually foreign to Islam, but it's not true if we look at its actual history. Every single one of these potential heirs to the throne of the Umayyads was killed, except for one young man that didn't attend the banquet. His name was Abdurrahman. And Abdurrahman, once he heard what happened to his family, quietly fled the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus. And his interesting background is very important to understand because Abdurrahman was not just an Arab. His mother was a Berber from North Africa. The Berbers had accepted Islam and were helping the Muslims in their conquests, in their expansion, and they were predominantly responsible for the initial entrance of the Muslims into Spain. So in 711, before the fall of the Umayyads, under the reign of the Umayyads, the Berbers united with the Arabs, and that's what allowed them to spread into Spain under Tariq bin Ziyad, who was granted with the conquest of Spain originally. And they went all the way into within 100 miles south of France, of Paris, where they were thrown back by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours. And this is a big event in history for people that promote European nationalism today because it is an indication of resistance to Islamic expansion. However, Tariq bin Ziyad established a system in Spain that had no fluidity. It had no balance. It had no stability. And so in 750, when Abdurrahman leaves the Umayyad Caliphate as it transfers to the Abbasids, and he wanders through the west, he goes sideways and zigzags all the way around for 5 years, and he arrives at the westernmost frontier of what is now the Abbasid Caliphate in 756 in Islamic Spain, and he settles in Cordoba, what we say Cordoba. The Muslims established there. He comes into a situation where there is an Amir or a leader there who is really not that competent. And so initially, what he does is he creates a large attraction because he's Arab, he's from a royal hair, he's part of a royal family, the Umayyad rulers. Everyone knows the Abbasids conquered, but this is all the way in the west, so it had really no significance. It was his ability to unite the Berber and the Arab that allowed Abdurrahman within a few short years of establishing control over Islamic Spain. And it was thereafter his ability to establish a stable system in Cordoba that he eventually established control of Islamic Spain in one coherent system under a new Umayyad Caliphate or a separate Umayyad Caliphate from the Abbasids. And so that's where the story of Islamic Spain begins, with the conquering in 711, transitioning into a coherent, stable system by 756 when Abdurrahman arrives. And so soon what we would see happen due to the understanding of Abdurrahman, which we must say is largely a consequence of the Umayyads' ability to stay open to Persian culture, the Roman culture, and to learn cosmopolitanism and to expand the horizons of Islam as it expanded. They did amazing things under the Umayyads. For example, they would transport seeds of coffee, seeds of trees from everywhere. They would replant them and they would create hybridization, which allowed them to vastly increase and diversify the agriculture. They learned how to dig irrigation ditches that they learned from the Roman territories that they conquered. And they developed a tradition of, because these empires of the Romans and the Persians were in decline, they developed this tradition of rebuilding what they had expanded to. And they were very consummate rulers and compassionate rulers, to the point where a lot of the territory that they quote-unquote conquered, or what the Muslims considered to be an opening or a liberation, was essentially taken into their system. So they were flexible. And one of the primary criticisms of the Abbasids in their propaganda against the Umayyads was that they had tolerance for others. So Abdurrahman comes with this already in his mind. When he establishes himself in Cordoba, he has to face questions about, for example, what do we do with the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians? How do we understand their coexistence? And essentially what he does is he places absolutely no restrictions on their interaction and their engagement. And so he sets forth these rules where there's one coherent Islamic Spain. And although there is a small piece of territory in the north that is still controlled by the Christians, so they did not control the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. But in Al-Andalus, there was a culture of tolerance, and they did the very same things. Because Abdurrahman knew about the agricultural systems that had been established in the Umayyad Caliphate, because he knew about the irrigation, because he knew about the developments in architecture, and because the Muslims during that period of time were starting to make breakthrough discoveries in science and merging religion with science and translating the Greek works, he was a very enlightened individual, and he applied that personal experience and the rise of Islam to its golden age in Al-Andalus independently with his own way of thinking, whereas the Abbasids were a bit more conservative in their adoption of other cultures and tolerance. Abdurrahman came with a very different mindset. And so soon the Andalusian Enlightenment that Abdurrahman would produce would set forth a system for about 300 years during the rule of first Abdurrahman, and then his son, and then his grandson, and then others that were affiliated with the Umayyad family, set forth a rule for about 300 years in Spain that embodies exactly what we might term a paradigm shift in human progress. It was a representation of reason and religion. It was a representation of scientific and artistic excellence, but predominantly and importantly of respect and tolerance for people of other faiths. It was in Al-Andalus that the basis for the society, which would last 800 years until the reconquest or the reconquista of the Christians, would endure the Crusades and largely would go on to induce what we would call the beginning of Western civilization. For example, as a Berber and an Arab, Abdurrahman's system set forth an ability to unite people who may have shared the same religion but had very different cultures and customs. That created the stability upon which the old infrastructure, the people that ruled in Spain or in Al-Andalus before the Muslims, were the Visigoths. And the Visigoths were not Catholic and they were not Roman, the two systems that had preceded them. They were people of Christianity that had their own sort of interpretation of the role of God. They did not consider Jesus equatable to Allah. They didn't consider the Trinity proper. So they were really largely outcasts from the rest of the Christian world. And they took over for the Visigoths, and the Visigoths had really run down because they had been ostracized as a Christian sect. The infrastructure and the systems of government, the roads, And so immediately Abdurrahman got to improving the infrastructure of the roads. And one of the things that he did that was innovative was he built irrigation canals into rural areas. And then he sent from the east for these hybridized agricultural products to be brought to Spain. And he would later in his life, on his deathbed, essentially write a poem that commented about the transplanting of the palm trees of Medina all the way to the point where they were planted in Spain and they could grow due to their developments in horticulture. And I'll read this for you. I wrote it down for this lecture because I think it embodies the way that Abdurrahman always saw himself as developing a unique system in Al-Andalus, but one which was built largely upon the place that he came from and the place that he always longed for. So he says a palm tree stands in the middle of Rusafa. Rusafa is a district in Islamic Spain. It is born in the west, far from the land of palms. I said to it, how like me you are far away and in exile. In long separation from family and friends, you have sprung from soil in which you are a stranger, and I, like you, am far away from here. I think it's very good because it shows that from the beginning, Abdurrahman consciously knew that this policy of transplanting even plants which are connected to the ecosystem of the Islamic world would have a consequence in introducing Islam to the Spanish people. And that's essentially what happened. By digging these irrigation canals and connecting the rural communities to the city, what he created was a unified infrastructure. He repaired roads and he repaired streets, and he also allowed Christians and Jews to preserve their synagogues and their churches while he built his own mosques. Yes, indeed, he charged them jizya, which was a tax poll he reduced significantly. But contrary to the mistakes that the Umayyads made with not accepting the conversions of Jews and Christians that accepted Islam willingly, which led to the overthrow in Abbasid, it's almost as if Abdurrahman learned from that experience. And so Abdurrahman, learning from that experience, started to accept the conversions of Christians. And because he was ruling so effectively and with tolerance, and with importing all kinds of things, not just agriculture, but scientific developments and technologies that at the time were unknown in that area or in the Christian world in and of itself, he was received very well. And most of the Christians of Al-Andalus and the territory he reigned in, 99% of them converted to Christianity. By the time he died, his offspring were developing a culture where they would marry these white, blue-eyed women and take them as wives. And it became very popular for people that were from the Islamic East to come see these white women who they found very attractive. And the offspring essentially were a way to unite Christian, Muslim, and Jewish populations. On top of that, by setting this template and this cornerstone and this foundation of tolerance, his followers were able to establish a society where Al-Andalus became home to Christian, Jews, and Muslims, where there was harmony and tolerance, where you could have people like doubters, basically atheists, living in a religious age that were of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic orientation that could sit in a house and debate principles and critique their own religions. And so society would benefit from that with regard to its understanding of the need and the necessity to understand religion with reason, rationality, and logic. And this is the form of Islam that eventually developed from that. In history, we call this period of time the convivencia, which basically translates into coexistence. It's basically one of the rarest periods of history where we have just a complete paradigm shift in consciousness for a temporary period of time. But the lesson that we can learn is the declination that we're going to get to. We can show the differentiation between the state of the Muslim world and Muslim civilization or Islamic civilization and the Christian West if we're just to analyze basic variables. The son of Abdurrahman, the Khalifa that followed him, had a library, a personal library of 700,000 volumes. The largest library in the Christian world at the time contained no more than 700 works. The society that was built in Spain was built on intellectualism. It was built on debate. Poets were honored. The arts were endorsed. Whereas Muslims today reject the portrayal of bodily figures in arts. That was considered normal. Singing, which is considered forbidden in the majority of the Islamic world, was promoted. It was a culture of spiritual and scientific learning to the utmost degree. The situation developed to the point where, after several generations, Al-Andalus and primary cities in Al-Andalus, such as Cordoba, had lit streets. The Arabs, due to this role that water plays in purification before prayer, had developed systems of making fountains, systems of making ponds, systems of decorating and laying out towns in a way that was conducive to what they were discovering geometrically with regard to pi and proportion. And so in every single city, you would have the mosque, which was the spiritual center of the town. But outside of the mosque, you would have the marketplace, the souk, where people would trade and merchants would engage. And even Christians and Jews were able to have their study circles on the outside periphery of the mosque. And then behind that would be the graveyard, which then would turn into the places that they would live. And so all of life centered around spirituality at the corner of the society and the development of life in the merchant and mercantile system that was introduced there. And so soon everybody that lived in Andalus, where they had very little selection and where the Christian Visigoths system was considering it forbidden to take more than one bath per month if you were under a certain caste, was all of a sudden surrounded by water, was all of a sudden had plumbing, running water, lit streets, paved roads, developments in carriages, and people were introducing concepts that would lead to the development of things like algebra, algorithms, mathematical principles. 3/4 of the stars in the sky are named by astronomers with Arabic names. Why? Because the Arabs had sophisticatedly advanced the study of astronomy to the point where the development of the astrolabe allowed them to make predictions in the sky, which was quite a technological progress that allowed for navigation, which allowed for their expansion. From every single direction, what Al-Andalus represented was a shift in consciousness, particularly for the northern Christian kingdoms, but also in general for mankind, because Abdurrahman had learned from the overthrow of his Umayyad Caliphate and his family's overthrow and their destruction about tolerance, because it was the lack of tolerance for the other that led to their eventual overthrow. Now, at the same time, the Abbasids are developing a system in Baghdad that is quite, in and of itself, known today as the Golden Age of Islam. So when the Abbasids ruled, they wanted to destroy Damascus because it represented everything that was Umayyad, and they never wanted to return to this beef, to this conflict. So they established their own capital in Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. And it was in Baghdad that they came into contact with a lot of the Greek philosophical works, particularly those of Aristotle and Plato. And they became meticulous and addicted to the translation of these works into Arabic. One of the most important developments of Abdurrahman and his descendants' 300-year reign in Spain is the fact that these translations made their way to that volume, those 700,000 volumes. Many of them were translations of Greek philosophers. The Christians were engaged before the Arabs arrived in killing all the heretics. And there was a lot of, if you didn't adopt the Roman interpretation of Christianity, you would be massacred. And in the course of that, any Christian sect that had pulled from Greek logic or Greek philosophy was killed for heresy, and then the books would be burned. So were it not for the Arabs preserving those works through their translation into Arabic, there would have been no ability for Western civilization, which largely bases itself on and believes itself to be a direct descendant of Greece and democracy and principles of philosophers in Greece. There would be no ability for this transmission of knowledge. And so it's very important to understand these principles, because just this in and of itself represents a rejection of the notion that there is a distinction and a uniqueness to Western civilization. Baghdad went on to develop systems that went on to influence Islamic Spain. But forever, during the 300-year period of what would be considered an alternative caliphate, the system of Abdurrahman and the developments of Al-Andalus under him and his descendants' reign expanded. You have amazing developments, not only in agriculture and the things that we've discussed, but even in architecture. The Arabs had developed abilities to build domes, and through their development in mathematics, their architecture was resemblant of some of the greatest works of art. One of the renowned sites in the world is the Mosque in Cordoba, for example, that Abdurrahman built during the end of his life. Al-Amra, an amazing piece of work which tries to replicate what the Quran describes as life in paradise through the utilization of what we call the number pi, which is the number of beauty, which is the number that artists use when they lay out their formulation, was adopted and innovated there in order to develop this sense that the space which was small actually looks expansionary. And that allowed for architecture to develop. So there is innumerable listings of innovations and adaptations and developments in society that occurred in Al-Andalus. However, whereas most people who study Islamic Spain today from a particular lens view it idealistically, what one has to understand is there's a much more important lesson in the decline of Islamic Spain, which does not start with the conquest of Isabella and Ferdinand and the Christian Spaniards, but actually in effect starts with the inability of the Muslims to retain the system that the Umayyads developed. And so, where does this start? Where does the start of the fading of the Andalusian Enlightenment begin? We might point it to a year 1009, which essentially is a culmination of a lack of Umayyad control. So, before this, we have to understand a transition in culture from amongst a very small portion of those that lived in Al-Andalus. When all of these Christians converted to Islam, 99% of them, they began to be fascinated with Arabic and all of these innovations that were coming. So the youth that formerly spoke Latin and were Visigoths, that were now under the rule and tutelage of this Islamic society, which brought all things new, was mesmerizing to them in the same way that American media, that American culture is influential around the world today. They started to imitate it. So they would dress like Arabs, they spoke Arabic, they said many things that were supportive of Arabic culture, to the point where they were called Mozarabs, meaning that they were not Arab, but they were Arab. Their culture was Arab. And that really brought on a lot of lamentation and resentment from people that still were trying to hold on to fundamentalist Christianity, or to the version of Christianity that existed in the Visigothic reign. One of those, for example, the most influential, was a very serious critic, Paul Alvarez. Paul Alvarez wrote a lot of work that said that it was absolutely despicable that these Mozarabs would study this culture as if it was superior, but yet they didn't even know any longer how to read Latin. And this didn't happen during the reign of Abdurrahman. This happened towards the turn of this transition into the decline. They represented a very fringe, almost extremist subset. It's almost like a situation of extremism from Christianity that we see from amongst ISIS today. But he would lament things like they don't know how to speak Latin, they don't study their own dogma, they don't understand Christianity, and essentially he was criticizing them as ignorant youth. He said, for example, for everyone who can write a letter in Latin, there are 1,000 of them, the Mozarabs, that can express themselves in Arabic eloquently. He didn't have many followers. He was a fringe preacher. However, some of the people that he did influence went on to do some significant things. So as he started criticizing this Mozarab culture and wanting to return to a pristine past, which is always one of the indicators of extremist movements, he started to tell these wannabe Arabs that they should reject and return to their original past. And about 50 of the people that he influenced went on to do so.
These were people who were living in an age where Mozarab's influence was almost complete in the population of the people that were in Al-Andalus. These people took it upon themselves to exploit one of the intolerant verdicts and positions of the Al-Andalusian Enlightenment, which we see as a position that continues to cause havoc today. So there's so many corollaries between this story and others in our modern era. One of the things that the Al-Andalusian imams and the clerical staff did not tolerate, that they transitioned into the maintenance of in Islamic Spain, was the position that anyone who insults the Prophet Muhammad, as one scholar put it, even if a person says that the button on the Prophet's shirt was dirty, he should be executed. So these people who were followers of Paul Alvarez and who adopted the positions that he adopted with regard to the need to reject Arabic culture, went out into town halls and they would say things such as the Prophet is a pedophile. We hear this a lot today. Such as Islam is a religion that worships the moon rock. We hear this today. That Muhammad was the Antichrist. And they knew they would be killed. They looked at themselves as martyrs. There was about 50 of them, and they were viewed by the Mozarabs as completely fringe. In the same way that the majority of Muslims today reject ISIS and Al-Qaeda, this was the ISIS and Al-Qaeda of the era. But the impact that they left would be significant, because there was always this little narrative that could later be exploited that justified this resistance to Islamic rule. They started to look at the history of Charles Martel and the pushing back against the Muslim south of Paris as something that they needed to also emulate. Now, this reconnection from amongst the fringe group of extremists to this rejection of Islam and its culture of tolerance coincided to phenomenon as the years went by that also led to fragmentation and polarization. So the Umayyads retained their independence, but back in the Abbasid system started to collapse. And in the year 900, the Fatimids, which were a group of Shiite rebels against the Abbasids, overthrew a large portion of their empire, and they came into North Africa. And so at this time, the Islamic Spain is under threat, because what if the Fatimids come in? They also looked at it as an opportunity, and so what they declared, the Abdurrahman III, so the grandson of Abdurrahman, declared that the Umayyads were now an official caliphate because the Abbasids had been abolished. And it sounded really good, but for the people that they ruled over and for the leaders and for the governors of the territories, they thought it was a little bit too much. They wanted to retain their independence, and they feared that the Fatimids would retaliate, and so they started to split away from Umayyad control. The Abbasids are breaking up, things are getting more difficult, and as time goes on, it is a fragmentation of the state. So these people that you would think would have rallied around the cohesiveness promoted by Abdurrahman III in his announcement of the resurrection of the Umayyad Caliphate actually felt threatened. So what happened is, instead of having one coherent Islamic Spain as had been developed under Abdurrahman and for a large portion of time his descendants, now you had independent little city-states formulate that started to war against each other. What this division did was it fractured the society to the point where civil war and conflict started to lead to civilizational decline. There was no cohesiveness, and tolerance as a result started to decrease. And that sort of opened up the system for another divide between Arabs and Berbers. So Abdurrahman and his biological lineage that was part Berber and part Arab had unified two races and cultures. And with the breaking up into city-states, essentially the Arabs and the Berbers went into a period of rift. That period of rift made it possible for the Berbers and the leaders of the Taifas, these city-states that were controlled by Berbers, to turn towards North Africa for assistance. And one leader, Mansour, who was Berber, came in to engage in an effort to what he called reunify Spain but it was under Berber way. It was under Berber control. And the Berber ideology was far different from the tolerant ideology espoused from Abdurrahman and his descendants. It was a much more geographically, they lived in a very desert-like climate. They hadn't been enlightened with the literacy of the Arab civilization. They came in with a very literalist understanding of Islam. And so from 972 until 1006, at the turn of the millennium, Mansur came in with Berber troops and basically abolished the Umayyad Caliphate that Abdurrahman III had promoted. The conquest that they engaged in was particularly ruthless, and it led to the destruction of much of what had been built under the Andalusian Enlightenment and the Umayyads. They also had experienced success to the point where they ransacked villages and they accumulated wealth, and that did not stop when they reached the borders of the end of the Umayyad territory. Whereas the Umayyads hadn't conquered the Christians in northern Spain, Mansur and his followers, the Berber soldiers that he had rallied, went in and they tried to ransack and to take control over the Christian world. They were fairly successful in doing so, but they were ruthless in the way that they took that territory. This was not the tolerance that the Al-Andalusian Christians and Jews had come to know. And so it was this ruthless conquest of Christian territory. For example, the brother of Jesus, James, had a tomb in northern Spain. And rather than just take the territory, they proceeded to knock down the tomb and to destroy and to dismantle what was considered a sacred site for all of Christendom. At the same time that this is occurring in 972 and 1006, there is also a period of early formulation of what would become the ideology of the Crusades. So this concept of jihad had started to impact the Christian understandings, particularly of the Catholic kingdoms. And they adopted this concept of jihad as they understood it as holy war. They misunderstood the concept of jihad, which was never applied in the same way Catholics applied their own expansionary war in the name of Jesus. But they adopted the principle, and they started to inseminate an ideology that said that Christians were obliged to take back territory that had fallen under Muslim control, predominantly centered around Jerusalem. But after the Berber soldiers of Mansur ransacked northern Spain and destroyed the tomb of James, they started to adopt this position with regard to the Islamic Spain. And so Christians started to try to take back territory to the south in Islamic Spain where they had, originally just succumbed to the fact that they weren't in control. So the Crusades, they start in 1095, but the fall of Al-Andalus starts with regard to this presence of Mansur. And Mansur comes, and he's followed by two other Berber-oriented dynasties, the Muwahhidun and the Murabitun. These people bring a very literalist, almost Salafist understanding of Islam that lacks tolerance, whereas there's no records in history of even a single killing and stoning for adultery in the history of early 300 years of tolerant Islamic Spain. And there's no record of a taking of the hand of the thief. All of a sudden, these punishments are prescribed in society. All of a sudden, the Jew and the Christian are looked at as disbelievers. They're oppressed. All of a sudden, the creed and legislation becomes no Jew can operate in the field of government, whereas Jews under the first 300 years of Al-Andalus had ascended to the highest levels of government. Christians had ascended to the highest levels of government. Now Christians and Jews were relegated, and they were told that no Muslim can touch a Christian or a Jew. That the only people who are allowed to clean up bathrooms are Christians and Jews, that Muslims are superior. And so you can see that this obviously induced a resentment in populations that had largely accepted Islam due to its tolerance and had collaborated in the scientific advancements that were developed in Al-Andalus. This leads to the sort of fervor and zeal that Christianity started to experience. And the Christians became more and more galvanized under this type of intolerant rule internal to Al-Andalus to ally with other Christians outside of Al-Andalus to try to take back territory. And one of the most important things that occurs simultaneously to the beginning of the Crusades in 1095 About a decade before that, Alfonso, who was a ruler of a territory in old Visigothic northern Spain, unconquered by Al-Andalus, creates an army, and he goes into Toledo in Al-Andalus, which is a town that is largely still tolerant to some degree, and he conquers it. A major city of Al-Andalus is conquered down by Christians. But what is very significant and important to point out, no matter the fact that it wasn't ideal and it wasn't as tolerant as the 300 years of Islamic rule under the Umayyad system, was that the reign of Alfonso was interesting because he took a mosque and he turned it into a church, but still the language spoken was Arabic. The culture, the art was coincident to the culture and the architecture of the Arabs. The culture of tolerance, he did not persecute Muslims, he did not persecute Jews. And he left the mosque open as a cultural center where all people of different religions could develop. And it was here in Toledo, the most important point, and you could have a lecture about Toledo and the transfer of this phenomenon in and of itself. But essentially what happened in Toledo is all of those works, those 700,000 volumes that existed in the library of Abdurrahman III, and the stuff that was continuously transported from the rest of the Eastern Muslim world into Al-Andalus was now translated from Arabic into Latin. And that included the Greek works. So there's the bridge between what we consider the origin of Western civilization in Greece. There was no Greek influence at that time in the Christian world, were it not for the translation of works into Arabic. And so now we set the stage for a European Renaissance in Christianity that has contact with the intellectualism that was preserved and promoted and brought in to Al-Andalus. It is at the same time that Alfonso was establishing this system and he establishes stability, the Crusades start to roar. And the very first crusade to take back Jerusalem starts in 1095. And so now the fervor and the zeal of the ideology that is found within the Crusades is starting to spread rampantly throughout Northern Europe and is adopted in major ways by the general Christian presence in the north. And so this fracturing into city-states that allowed for the conquest of the Muwahideen, Murabitin, and other Berber-dominated Islamic systems allowed for the Christians to start to take back territory slowly, and over a period of a couple hundred years, they gradually reduced territory by territory control that the Muslims had. Sometimes they would leave Muslims in charge of the town, but they would be subject to the dictates of Christians. The culture and Arabic influence started to slowly decrease as a result, and the tables had essentially turned. By 1277, the very last place in Spain was in Granada. Granada would last for a very long period of time until 1492, when Isabella and Ferdinand would come in and conquer. The end and the declination of Islamic Spain is particularly important. And final point, although it is a lecture again in and of itself, is where there's this transfer of knowledge and reason and its synthesis with religion that continues with the West and the Christian world. And there's this decline in interpretation, this clinging to traditionalism that rejects science and reason to a large degree in the Muslim world. So whereas great scholars like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, Ibn Khaldun, people who had induced and translated things like Aristotle's works and then elaborated on them from an Islamic lens, these are the books, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, which is basically the first book of history. He was basically the first social scientist. Books of the journeys that were made by Muslim explorers. translated in Toledo originally, started to make their way into Western Europe and started to impact what was a cultural renaissance. So now Christianity was faced with their own developments of their own thinkers, of their own peoples. And they started to pull out of what we call the Dark Ages. Dark Ages cannot be considered the Dark Ages except for in Northern Europe. People use the term a lot as if it was universal. It wasn't. Certainly wasn't the case in the Islamic world. But they pulled out of the Dark Ages through this contact. And they continued to expound upon this work, which was this great mark of scholarship that steered clear and separated between religion. As Ibn Khaldun, he put it something like this in Muqaddimah, that religion should be focused on the study of the world to come, whereas politics and society and the social sciences should be separated, for they are solely confined to the affairs of this world. Meaning religion was more important, but that it should not impact how you organize society, because these are different issues. Worldly and otherworldly affairs should be separated from each other. Instead, concepts that, like those that were promoted by Ibn Sina, for example, who translated Aristotle, and that work started to be passed around the Muslim world. Scholars such as Imam Ghazali, who is known as a reformer and a preserver of the tradition, pushed back against this reliance on the Greek philosophers, and he wrote a work called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And essentially he argued that logic and reason has no place in religion. And he used things like the miracles of the Quran and the miracles of the Prophet to suggest that, look, there can be no simple causal or effectual relationship between X and Y, because that's what Aristotelian logic is built on, the immovable mover, which Ibn Sina understood as Allah. When Aristotle is philosophizing about the immovable mover, it means I don't know because I can't see what the origins are, but I can go back essentially to the Big Bang and the origins of everything. And from there, I can understand my reality by understanding causal and effectual relationships. That's a big cornerstone of how we study phenomenon in the world. And it set forth a scientific paradigm that Europe was able to expound upon and expand upon. But instead, in the Muslim world, Imam Ghazali comes along, and he was a spiritual master, there's no doubt about that. Some interesting tidbits of his life, suggest that there were reasons why he was sort of opposed to the introduction of Aristotelian philosophy, and he wasn't the only one, but he wrote a very popular work called The Incoherence of Philosophers. And he argued, again, that these principles of philosophy and logic were misunderstood, and he basically argued for only reference to the Islamic scripture when it came to science, and that all that we needed to know could be found in the works of Islamic scholarship and Islamic texts. He rejected the influence of the advancements that were found by Ibn Sina to be quite interesting, and he induced a mysticism that rejected this reference to rationality and the accommodation and the synthesis of reason and religion. It's important to understand that Imam Ghazali had his detractors, and one of them, his name is Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd, in response to Imam Ghazali's work, wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Incoherence. Essentially, the incoherence of Imam Ghazali's incoherence of the philosophers. And he rejected it and completely ripped it apart. Because there was a support in the Muslim world and amongst the leadership of the Muslim world for Imam Ghazali, the most important impact that book had was the fact that it made its way into Christian Europe and is largely responsible for the passing of Aristotelian logic to the European civilization. They adopted it, they loved it, they ate it up, they built upon it, and it totally transformed their intellectual thinking. And so that's the beginning of the decline. That's the beginning of all of these developments in Europe and the decline of scientific progress, civilizational progress, of a reversion back in the Muslim world to fragmentation, to civil war and internal conflict, and an inability to expound upon what culminated in Andalusian's enlightenment, or Al-Andalus's enlightenment. By 1492, the last stronghold of the Muslims in Granada is taken by Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. They take the keys to Alhambra from Abu Abdil, the Muslim ruler in that territory. He hands over the keys to them in 1492 on the agreement that Muslims will still be able to retain their religion. So the Muslims are satisfied with this. 9 years later, they abolish that verdict. Immediately in 1492, within 3 weeks, they pass a verdict that all Jews that don't convert to Christianity will be killed or need to be expelled. The Jews, they run to the Ottoman Empire because they know from Al-Andalus that the Muslims are relatively tolerant. And essentially what happens is they start to transgress to the point where we get the Reconquista, which leads into the Inquisition, because they abolish 9 years later this rule that Muslims can retain their religion, and then they start to say either convert or die. And all of the Muslims take rulings that are appropriate in Islam, and they say, I convert to Christianity. After a while, and it's important because we can resemble this to Islamophobia today, even if a person who, they were known as Moriscos, the Moors, it was a derogatory term for those that had adopted Islam, that were Moors, Muslims, and that they had adopted Islam, that they had adopted Christianity. And so there started to be rumors about the fact that they were faking it, that they were faking assimilation, that they were actually practicing their religion. And it got to the point where if they practiced Christianity more, the more pork that they ate, the more they went to church, the more they dressed like the Christians, the more the accusations would be that they were practicing what today we call taqiyya. They were secretly trying to resurrect Islamic Spain and that they needed to be expelled. And it led to widespread massacres. At the same time, in 1492, immediately after Ferdinand and Isabella, and this is a very interesting tidbit of history, European colonialism and imperialism ensues, because we all know that the Spanish Empire was the very first manifestation of empire, both in the West and then in Latin America. And so the forced conversions of Catholicism through their misunderstandings of the conceptualization of jihad starts to take place and have a global impact. In 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. He's funded by Isabella and Ferdinand, but he's actually sailing on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, 3 ships that belong to and were created under Islamic rule in Spain. The guides on those ships all only spoke Arabic. All of the navigational tools were Arabic. The astrolabe that they used to get to the New World was Arabic. And we now know that people in Mali that were Muslims had already visited the New World. But it was this information that was able to be exploited to the point where European expansion, under largely the conceptualizations that were birthed in the Crusades in the period of rampant sort of fanaticism from amongst Europe's Christian populations, was carried over and started to be implemented around the world. And so this is the story of Spain. This is the story of the birth of and wonderful 300 years of Spain that we might refer to today in our understanding of how to get back out of the predicament that we find ourselves in. Because if we were to transfer today to talk about the similarities between our current situation, the similarities between what we are and what we did experience with the decline of the Andalusian Enlightenment, we will realize that we need another situation like that which formulated in Andalus. And that without one, we are likely to experience a period of decline, which I might add, the decline lasted for several hundred years. So we might not think necessarily that progress is a given. I think in today's day and age, we assume that the liberal international order will continue to simply evolve, and we take it for granted. If we look at real history, we realize that history is marked by periods of black swan events. What Nassim Nicholas Tatum in his book Black Swan says, that history is not a period of steady progress, but instead it's marked by outlying events that nobody could see happen. And that they are transformational events that represent hubs of exponential growth, phenomenon that occur that no one could foresee. And I think that it's very evident that the story of Abdurrahman's migration and his 300-year history is a black swan in history. But it's followed by largely 500 years of intolerance in the very region that he developed this tolerance system in. And so we can learn a lot from this when we consider and we take a step back and we look at what's going on. What's going on inside of our own society today? We look at the United States, for example. A group of zealots on 9/11 from Al-Qaeda led by Osama bin Laden attacked us in an attack that was rejected by a large portion of Muslims around the globe. Now, flash back to the ideologue who promoted the idea that the Mozarabs, by imitating Arabic culture, were essentially losing their pristine past and needed to rebel. Think of that as Osama bin Laden, who makes the same claim that the westernization of the Islamic world needs to be repressed and rebelled against. Think of the claim that he needed to declare war on the United States of America simply because they had housed troops on Saudi Arabian soil to prevent the expansion of Saddam Hussein from conquering Kuwait. Same narrative. And 19 hijackers blow up the World Trade Center and attack the Pentagon and try to blow up the White House in hijacked airplanes in what's considered a completely neurotic attack, rejected by most of the world at the time. Now remember the martyrs of Spain, who adopted the ideology of their fundamentalist preacher and went forth to go out into the town and preach that the Prophet Muhammad was a pedophile, that Islam was a barbaric religion, and that it was backwards, and that they worshipped the moon god, and that they were basically antichrists being ushered in. Same situation of those 19 hijackers. Everyone rejected them, and later they became eulogized. Because the reaction of the Islamic Al-Andalusian society was what? Strict understanding of the condition of the one who needed to be killed for insulting the Prophet Muhammad. No flexibility, no understanding that that could have ramifications that would reverberate and completely affect the stability of the state. Well, how did we react to 9/11 and the act of a bunch of zealots? In the same way. So we declared a global war on terror, which split the world into you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And a lot of general Muslims began to be conflated as sympathizers with the jihadists. They preoccupied our minds, and we went into a period of time that we called the clash of civilizations. A clash between Islam and the West. Just like after these martyrs induced a resurrection over time of a return to zeal, and then the Crusades induced this notion that we needed to control Jerusalem, and that the Muslims were heathens that needed to be countered. Same conditions apply. We stood in a very different position after we won the Cold War. We won the Cold War and we battled against what was basically totalitarianism presented as socialism and communism, but which represented a struggle between the free world based upon the rights of the individual versus the totalitarian communistic states which believed in the rights of the state. And we won that. And it looked like we had entered a period where we could enter another paradigm shift in human consciousness. Francis Fukuyama, classically a scholar of political science, wrote a book as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And in 1991, he authored a book called The End of History. The end of history, he postulated, was that with the end of the Cold War and the bipolar order and the rise of the United States as a hegemonic power, we were witnessing the end of history as such. Not the end of history from time perspective, but the end of history with regard to the quest to discover the best way to formulate the organization of human society. He essentially said that liberal democracies had conquested, and that there would be nothing else left to history but for the rest of the world to develop and advance into a unified global order based upon liberal democracies and nation states working in conjunction with one another. That was rejected by a lot of people as too idealistic and utopic. In 1991, George Bush, then President George Bush, not the one that would come after, announced that there was a new world order. That now the beacons of light and hope in the world could be expanded. Let me see real quick how he said it. I have it here. He put it like this. He said that we are on the threshold of a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. And that's what Fukuyama said was going to be destined to happen. But he also did that in the context of the invasion of Iraq, the occupation or the presence on Saudi Arabian soil of Muslim troops, and basically the onset of what would eventually become the war on terror, while proclaiming that the New World Order would induce an end to terror. And so he proclaimed a New World Order of liberalism in lieu of war. And that war was an incredibly successful one. It was very quick. It showed America's predominance in the international stage, and it seemed like it was a just war, taking care of a dictator who was expanding into Kuwait, and who the Kuwaitis were seen as someone who were going to take that trek towards liberalism. So detractors said differently. And one of Francis Fukuyama's teachers, Samuel Huntington, wrote an article in 1993 in Foreign Affairs, the predominant international affairs journal in the world, called The Clash of Civilizations. And he argued that no, what Fukuyama said was absolutely absurd. That while nation states might no longer go to war with each other, and several of them may take steps towards developing their own internal democracies and their own internal free market systems, and the protection of the individual as opposed to the protection of the state, in fact, now what we would see is we would see culture wars. Wars between religions, wars between ethnicities, and civil conflicts based upon ethnic struggle. This Clash of Civilizations model promoted this concept of the green scare as opposed to the red scare. So what Huntington argued is that the predominant threat now would become the Muslim world against the West. And that the end of the red scare, which was communism, would be replaced with the green scare. He called it the green peril. Groups like the Muslim Brotherhood might come to power in the Middle East, and Islam may represent a threat that we needed to be proactive in addressing immediately. And so that theory really ran popular from amongst a lot of theorists in international affairs for quite a long time. And it became mainstream, particularly in conservative circles and realist circles. And so on September the 11th, 2001, the administration of George Bush III had to make a decision about how to respond to the attacks. And the way that the administration largely saw the world was through the Clash of Civilizations perspective, and that's exactly why they put forth this concept of you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. What are the reactions by the Muslim jihadists? About a month after that, Osama bin Laden sits on a mountaintop somewhere in Pakistan with Taisir Aluni, a reporter for Al Jazeera that later would be put in Guantanamo for interviewing him. And he says that what George Bush said is right. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. But he considers the United States the terrorist on the principle that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. He frames it in a way where he says you're either with us or you're with the terrorists or you're with the United States, with a verse from the Quran that says he who supports a Jew or a Christian, or he who imitates them or supports them, he is actually one of them. And that this means that people that supported George Bush, even by one word he says, have become non-Muslims have become non-Muslims altogether. And so now he sets forth this precedent upon which the civil conflict between jihadis and other people who claim to be Muslim in the Muslim world is basically commonplace today. So the Clash of Civilizations model perpetuated, and now we're 18 years into the war on terror. George Bush III did say when he announced his us versus them paradigm that this crusade is going to take a while. And the crusades lasted for hundreds of years. But I think it's safe to say that 18 years into the war on terror, which is a relatively short period of time, we're not that much better off than we were on September the 11th, 2001. For example, a recent report by the Center for Strategic International Studies showed that there are 4 times at least as many Salafi jihadists today as there were in the world on 9/11. The number of groups growing and mounting. And also, apart from that, the Clash of Civilizations model has come home to roost, because a consequence of jihadism has been to induce an Islamophobia in the West that has forced part and parcel of a polarizing divide where the left and the right now are completely divided, and essentially we have a civil war system in the United States where liberals on the West Coast and the East Coast exist in a very different way than the rest of the middle of the country. And if you look at the proportion of people that support or red states and blue states, you can see that we are incredibly divided, and we are on course for what potentially could become civil war. We had a polarizing presidency of Barack Obama, largely because he was black, not exactly for the same reasons that we have a polarizing president now. That led us to our current situation. And now the rhetoric of the Trump administration, whether you think it's appropriate or not, does tap into the similar clash of civilizations paradigm that has predominantly propelled us since 9/11. And so what do? How can we change course in a clash of civilizations that is setting us up, if we really look at the situation, Russia, China, Iran now set to control the future of the Middle East and Syria, Bashar al-Assad, the authoritarian, in steady control there, posing a risk to the international order, the reassertion of power of authoritarianism, a widespread anti-Americanism throughout the world, but in the Middle East predominantly, a rejection of democracy amongst people because the Arab Spring didn't work out so well, largely because we did not support it everywhere and anywhere on principled belief. And we see fragmentation everywhere. We see economic catastrophe. We had a financial crisis in 2007 and 2008 that led to essentially what was called the Great Recession, which led us to adopt fiscal and monetary policies that we now have no tools to fix if we slide back into a recession. We have horrendous economic forecasts on the horizon from amongst primary economists. So economically speaking, politically speaking, socially speaking, and then we have a culture of narcissism, which has now reduced us to an ability where most people will never listen to the entirety of this lecture because they can only pay attention to a 30-second cat clip. They don't read books in their entirety. They read short notes and blurbs. And we've really lost a lot of culture because our culture is based upon a narcissistic tendency. We have things and phenomenon that are surrounding us that are pushing us further into ignorance. Ask a leftist why they hate Trump, and they'll tell you facts about policy that simply are untrue. Ask a conservative facts about leftists or Democrats, and they'll tell you a conspiracy theory that simply is not true. We are a very misinformed culture at the moment. And we could really use a neo-Andalusian Enlightenment because it was largely based on the transmission of knowledge. And so those are the principles upon which we might say we need to take a step back and say, wow, this world is not going in a positive direction, but how do you change? Well, essentially what we can learn from the Andalusian Enlightenment, the original Andalusian Enlightenment, is that we cannot address an issue at the same level of consciousness that created it, as I quoted Albert Einstein in the beginning. When you react to terrorism, or when you react to extremism or radicalization with a similar resentment and misunderstanding of the enemy, then what you do is you only further the cause of extremists who wish to split the world into us versus them, black versus white. Instead, what you need to do is you need to adopt the principle of understanding the enemy, right? In the same way that we say that he who fails to study history is doomed to repeat it. And in the same way that the art of war says, know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not fail to lose 1,000 battles, we have not understood our enemy as the fringe group that it is. And we have conflated large numbers of Muslims to the point where we have adopted a position where we've brought Islamophobia onto our own, which only furthers the cause of the jihadists. So reacting to a problem at the same level of consciousness that created it is not the solution. Instead, the solution is to understand that we do not live in an era, first and foremost, of civilizations in the plural. We have cultures in the plural. But cultures are bound by universal principles. That's one of the things that we should have learned from the development of democracy and the liberal order that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his administration basically set the world on course for at the end of World War II. Instead, what we have in civilization in the singular is the notion that we are all a product of a collective effort of humankind that is marked by black swans and periods of history where there is an enlightenment that takes mankind to a new level of thinking and consciousness. And that's what the Andalusian Revolution represented. It's what the American Revolution represented, was a culmination of Enlightenment thinking that was finally put into practice because it was given a safe space through which it could develop itself. And it was able to rebel from the British imperialism and set up a system that basically changed the entire world. So it's not just Islamic Spain, but what happens is there's a dialogue of civilization that is needed as opposed to a clash of civilizations. Now, when you say dialogue of civilization, it's a term that's been used before, but it's never been used in the singular. And that's important because if you were to misunderstand what I was saying and you were to go to Google dialogue of civilizations in the plural, by accident, you would find out that in reaction to the Clash of Civilizations paradigm, the Iranians actually used it as a propaganda effort in the UN, starting this dialogue of civilization, which was a reaction to Clash of Civilizations. But their dialogue of civilizations accepted as civilizations in the plural, and the presumption before they would engage in dialogue was that their system was superior. So that's not dialogue. Dialogue is what happened in Al-Andalus when people that renounced their own religions were able to get into the center of a mosque and a community center and talk about why they renounced their own religions and the religion of the other to take reason to the next level. That's dialogue. Dialogue is the ability of atheists to operate in a society and not be persecuted because they were living in Islamic Spain. Dialogue is the ability to assimilate the Christians and to let them become Muslims. Dialogue is the conversation that Europe eventually had with the Greek translations that were imported. That's dialogue. That's dialogue. Dialogue is not, I'm right, you're wrong, but let's talk to show that we're tolerant. That's not true tolerance. But if you understand civilization as a culmination of all of mankind, then you can understand, even in the way that we understand Islam, as the byproduct of a long trajectory of monotheism. Then we can study progress and civilization as a byproduct of all of human contributions. And that's where we get into the concepts which are so important in truly understanding Islam, concepts such as Bani Adam. The Quran calls humankind Bani Adam because Adam and Eve are our original men and women. And Bani Adam is tribe. Bani is tribe in Islam, and so it means that we are one global tribe. And this is a concept that is very distinguishable from the way we see the world today. So that is a singular civilization. And a dialogue in civilization is known when we look at verses such as Allah says in the Quran that I have created you in different colors, cultures, and tongues so that you can travel around and get to know one another. The very purpose of your life is to mingle with those that don't look like you, that speak differently than you. What an embodiment of that in Islamic Spain. What an embodiment of that very principle in Islamic Spain. And so there is something to be said about a neo-Andalusian Enlightenment that can bridge this space that we see ourselves in between the Christian West, as right-wing radicals call it, and the Islamic Orient, between the Orientalism and the Occident, between the West and the East, between all of these conflicting views. We need to promote this principle because it's a higher order principle, the concept of a singular dialogue. And Al-Andalus is an embodiment of that. And so where do we go from here? While jihadists call for a taking back of Al-Andalus after attacks that mow down innocent civilians in the street, we need to see the correlations. And we need to understand the outcomes of extremism, even though it was minor actions. It sets us on a trajectory for more conflict and divide, in the same way that those martyrs were considered fringe and nobody paid any attention to them, but they ultimately led to a return of the zeal and the fervor that was intolerance, and were ultimately able to induce and help induce a nostalgia that exists unto this day in the West, as if they were heroes. They're called martyrs from amongst fundamentalist Catholics. So we need a series of principles that can take us to the next level. And so part of what I do now, I actually am a former jihadist. And so I've come full circle in my own thinking and my own ideological awarenesses. And one thing that I've understood is that what Islam represents is a complete shift in consciousness. It was something revealed in the 7th century to a man in the desert. And this man was born amongst people that were eloquent poetically, and he received the greatest literary work that exists on the face of the earth, but one that to this day challenges us to unite reason and religion. But that we still understand as if it is the 7th century and as if there's no flexibility in our interpretation of it. Well, how can we get back to the root principles of this original paradigm shift? Because there is no Al-Andalus if there is no Prophet Muhammad, and there is no Prophet Muhammad if there is no Jesus, and there is no Jesus if there is no Moses, and it's all interconnected. And in Islam, we have the belief that there was 144,000 different prophets, that the stories that are in the Bible, in the New Testament, and in the Quran are not the only stories. They're the stories that have become most prominent because of the Middle East and its linchpin as the center of society. But all of mankind has had its prophets, and the impact of those prophets unite us under this concept of Tawheed, that there's only one God, and that every human being on the planet will not only meet him someday and be held accountable for what they believed and what they did with their lives, but also that we all, as human beings, have knowledge inside of us that we all come from that source. And that ultimately is where the concept of monotheism and Tawheed can lead to this adoption of tolerance. And so what I do now is I work at an organization called Parallel Networks, and we run a portal called Light Upon Light, which is a very new initiative. That portal, Light Upon Light, promotes these ideas that are associated with the concept of a new enlightenment. And it does so through a verse of the Quran, which talks about Allah as the light of the heavens and the earth, and then it talks about the different levels of His light. And one of those levels and manifestations of His light is an understanding that Allah says in the Quran that His light is neither of the east nor the west, which in and of itself, if understood properly, is a rejection of the very concepts and the divides between the West and the East, between the Orient and the Occident, that mark the clash of civilizations paradigm. So we build off of that. And we flesh out programming, we flesh out activities, we flesh out public speakings like these that can impart a better understanding. And to all of our audience and the individuals that are here today, we say that in an age of intersecting extremisms with history set for a period of decline akin to this one, and there's many ways you could tell this story through the lens of other civilizations and periods of time, but Al-Andalus is particularly appropriate, that we all have an obligation to do something with our lives to combat hate and extremism and the polarization that we see pushing us further into this decline and into potentially an abyss. And we build our Neo-Andalusian Enlightenment around three principles, and then we'll end and open the door and the floor for questions. Three principles that we consider antithetical to those that have essentially come to predominate our world. The first, the promotion of a global democratic identity. While we live in a world of nation states and we all have nationalist identities, because we're interconnected, we're all able to communicate with people across the globe, particularly with regard to social media and communications advancements. We live in a world where 6 degrees of separation has now turned into 3.2 degrees of separation on Facebook. Basically, that means that between me and every other individual in the world, there's 3.2 people. That means that we are interconnected to a degree greater than we've ever been before globally. Yet we all have these nationalist identities, but the problem is as the jihadis promote a transnational identity that overcomes and is of a sort of higher order principle than this, I'm confined to my nation state, we need to get better at promoting a global democratic identity if in fact we're going to reverse course and aspire to the idealistic notion that Francis Fukuyama proposed with his End of History. We should aspire to live in a world that's blanketed not only by nation states, but by liberal democracies, because that ultimately, democracies that side beside each other, for international theorists that are in the room, no, they don't war with each other. And so global democratic identity is a higher order principle of shift in consciousness. And then we call for creative pacifism, because creative pacifism is the principle that arts and creativity are the only means of effecting sustainable paradigm-shifting change in any society or culture. That is based on the principle that when we look at extremists, they get empowered by the concept of violence as the means to transformative change. What we know as we study and we make advancements in our understanding of why people do what they do is that the very same sensations that can be experienced. For example, we say that extremist movements offer senses of meaning, purpose, and significance to their adherents, right? But we know that nonviolent movements and social movements can offer that same sense of meaning, significance, and purpose. So nonviolent movements use violence not as a tactic or a strategy, they reject it. But if nonviolent movements can adopt principles of art and creativity that are of a higher level or order of consciousness, think of the Arab Spring, where the Egyptian youth and the millennial youth of the Arab world showed their talent, showed their curiosity, showed their artistic capacity, showed their organizational skills. And didn't that resurrect a sort of potential for a paradigm shift apart from the Clash of Civilizations model? Remember, most people don't, but remember the Occupy movement? Remember Wisconsin's teachers protesting and unions protesting against the right to work campaigns, and all of them said that they were inspired by the Arab Spring. But it wasn't sustained because there was no plan. There was no principles upon which a new formulation of the Middle East could be born, and there was no backing from the powers that be as well. We must state that, even though our president flew to Cairo and gave a wonderful speech about resurrecting relations with the Muslim world, when given the opportunity to ally with those that were calling for democracy and liberalism, he totally refrained, and that's very important to understand. We have to be critical of our own selves, just as critical of our own selves as we are of the enemy if we're really going to have a paradigm shift, and that can be expressed through creativity. Creativity can overcome polarization, because it can empathize with the other. A large portion of art, creative expression, is in portraying the other in a way that is empathetic. And empathy is really our key. So our final principle, the third principle after global democratic identity and creative pacifism, is an enlightened humanism. Right now, the war on terror is essentially run through a behavioralist lens. That means that academics and institutional individuals study the phenomenon of terrorism, and they do it empirically. Evidence-based practices. We need to study the problem before we address it. We need data, we need data, we need data, and then we'll tell you what policy to implement. They don't understand the limitations of empiricism in social science, and one thing that we're learning, for example, one question to point this out for people that want to understand better this principle, it might be a diversion. For the longest time, rational actor theory drove economics. Rational actor is that on the aggregate, mankind will make decisions based upon his own interests, and that he will ultimately arrive at rational conclusions. Well, a non-economist came along and studied the behavior of decision-making and risk-taking, and proved beyond all doubt, his name is Daniel Kahneman, that people are not rational, and that rational actor theory is a fraud. And he basically destroyed and dismantled economic theory under the behavioralist reductionist school, and he won a Nobel Prize for economics, having never read or taken an economics class in his life. We are learning so much along the lines of what Kahneman learned, that enlightenment is one step around the corner. And enlightened humanism understands that empathy is inherent in the human condition, but that in a culture of narcissism and self-seeking sort of competition with others for limited resource, the world that we live in today, which is promoted on our TV, Survivor, vote the guy off, popularity contests, reality TV show of people walking around and trying to find people to sleep with, that this is not humanism and this is not enlightenment. And an enlightened humanism is understanding the limitations of empiricism, because when you need data and you assume people are rational actors, and they're not, then you're going to build systems where you're going to make mistakes, such as thinking that a program and a solution can have an impact that's positive and actually being counterproductive in the long run. Why? Because you studied a snapshot in a piece of time and you got your data, but that was appropriate for, let's say you collect your data in 2004, and then you use it in your academics in an ivory tower who have never actually been in the space that the terrorist exists in and know the nuances of the ideology, for example, formulate policies and practices and programs based upon a snapshot of data in 2004, but by the time it's implemented in 2006, extremist organizations and terrorists are incredibly fluid, so the situation on the ground has already changed. We have to recognize the limitations of empiricism. And the consequences of empiricism are behavioralism, the idea that people are Skinnerian rablets or Pavlovian dogs. You give a rat a pellet when he presses a button, and he'll press a button. You can train them. through external stimuli. So we create counter-messaging campaigns to impact ideas, and Think Again, Turn Away tries to tell people rationally not to join ISIS. But people are not rational. So an enlightened humanism understands these limitations and understands that as extremist movements are fluid, we need fluid grassroots-led systems. And that's what Light Upon Light essentially is. It is a grassroots movement that's dedicated to building a network that can challenge and combat violent extremism networks, because first we build the concept that only networks can struggle against networks, but that those networks need to be built on, the positive network needs to be built on the positive narrative, for example, of a neo-Andalusian Enlightenment, but also the positive narrative that we can build our network on antithetical principles to those of the extremists. And that's what global democratic identity, creative pacifism, and enlightened humanism represents. And so the only way that we will again be able to establish a new paradigm shift in human consciousness is if we look at periods of history like Islamic Spain that shatter the views and the perspectives that a large portion of us hold, whether we like to admit it or not. We are all interconnected today through communication, but we're also interconnected through our entire history. We are all human beings that are the descendants of original Homo sapien, and we are all alike in so many more ways than we are different. And so we end with a prayer that the God of all of our understanding allows us all to have introspection and a benefit, that once we realize beautiful stories like this, we can pass them on, and we can take from what happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago and apply those principles today. And the most important takeaway and lesson is that we don't want to experience a period of decline. And so in the same way that the extremists say at the end of their lectures and invite people to come join them, we ask you to come join us. Doesn't matter how limited amount of time you have or whether all you want to do is share our videos and articles on social media. The campaign at Light Upon Light is an open invitation for participation from people around the world, all of which have come to realize that the way we've been addressing extremism, polarization, and hate has only made it worse on the aggregate, and that each and every single one of us need to understand that this is a generational struggle, and we all have a part to play in determining the future of tomorrow. We can't let it up to the empiricists in the ivory tower, nor the leaders of governments around the world who increasingly serve only the interests of a very small segment of human population. So we end with the Muslim prayer, Rabbana atini fid dunya hasanatan wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina adhaban nar. May Allah grant us the good of this world and the good of the hereafter. And we might add, and may He allow us to separate between the two as we exist on this earth. Ameen. Thank you for listening. We'll open up the door for question and answer. Jazakallah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.